under your butt.
Da-da-da. Oh, hello. Welcome to episode 140 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. As usual, I'm joined by Mary, a woman whose height could confuse her as being one of Santa's Christmas elves. I am just a stocking full of coal named Darren. How we doing, Mary?
That was a great introduction considering it's the Christmas season, so thank you for that.
It's
and
that
for
time of year.
making fun of my height again.
Oh, that's a never-ending gift. No, that's my Christmas gift. No question about that. So how you doing, Zen? Okay.
I'm great. It's good to be back recording tonight. How are you?
It is. Oh, very good to be back. It's great to be back. And tonight's a special night, Mary. I don't know if you know this, but we have a special guest today, which is Dr. Robert K.D. Colby. Let me introduce him real quick. Dr. Colby is an assistant professor at the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, focusing on the American Civil War. He got his bachelor's degree at the University of Virginia. He got his master's and PhD at the University of North Carolina. He is a solid fellow Atlantic Coast Conference guy, Mary, and he is also the winner of the Society of Americans Allen Nevins Prize and the Society of Civil War Historians Ann B. Bailey Prize. His work has been published in the Journal of the Civil War Era, the Journal of Early Republic and Slavery and Abolition. In his latest book, which I happen to have right here, is the subject of today's talk, and that is An Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South. Welcome, Robert. How are we doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining us tonight for this.
It is our pleasure to have you on. I mean, we don't do a lot of guests, which is great. So when we have guests on, we want to definitely really enjoy the experience. And I think, this book is good. It's tough, but it's very necessary. And really its explanation of the sheer economics of slavery in the South. And it really goes a long way to explain that front and center place in really the causes of the American Civil War. So I think it's a book that I think is fantastic. So before we kind of just start talking about the book, I guess what was you thinking in writing this one?
Sure. So it was really a question of finding things as I was doing research that didn't seem to fit. And so I was doing research as a graduate student. I was looking for something to write about as I was doing my dissertation, and I had read a number of books about the domestic slave trade, the trade in enslaved people within the United States. Takes place throughout American history, but really picks up in the early 1800s after Congress bans the importation of enslaved people from Africa. As a result, this really robust business in trading people within the United States picks up and really accelerates across the first half of the 19th century. So there a lot of people had written really great books about that. I was reading those. But I'm also a Civil War guy. That was kind of where my interests lie. And I was also reading, I did my graduate work at the University of North Carolina, as you said, which has one of the best collections of personal papers from the Civil War era, particularly on Southern papers, but also a large number of Civil War soldiers' papers. And I was spending time, I was poking around in that library. And I started to see these references to either Confederates buying and selling people during the Civil War, or Union soldiers commenting on encountering people who were fleeing for fear of being bought or sold. And this struck me as really strange because, we know, if you know anything about the Civil War, you know how cataclysmic a conflict it is. You also know, if we're taught anything about the Civil War, we're taught that it ends in the abolition of slavery. And so it struck me as really strange and surprising that that the slave trade would have continued during the Civil War. And yet I was sitting in front of these letters and diaries and other documents that said it very much did. And so the book really came out of an effort to try to unpack that and solve this puzzle and try to figure out why is this thing that feels like it shouldn't be happening. Why is it happening? And once, I really had established that it was, why? What's happening? What does it tell us? And what does it tell us about both slavery on the one hand and the Civil War on the other?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we talk big picture like you just did. We'll whittle it down a small picture, but what the book really delves into is the sale of slaves aspect, which was their greatest fear. And there were several jaw-dropping aspects of this book for me. And for me, there was an assumption that, at least I thought, as the war went on, that the number of slaves would have dropped just by logic. But what surprised me was the percentage of enslaved people in the South at the beginning of the war versus the end maintained between 80 and 85%. And that's fascinating to me when you think about that. And then when you think about the sheer economics of it all, cotton was the oil of the 19th century. It really, really was. And its importance was international. And so for that purpose, a vibrant slave population was necessary to feed the world's need for cotton at that time, especially overseas. So when you think about it, slaves were commodities, and slave markets traded them on their way, similar to the way stockbrokers deal in stocks today. The prices ebbed and flowed depending on the war and location of the nearest Union army. And your book fantastically describes that. It talks about the Richmond slave firms, Hill Dickinson and Company, for example, Blount and Dawson in Savannah, Robert Lumpkin in his infamous jail in Richmond, the Devil's Half Acre, as well as Joseph Bruin in New Orleans, and your book talks specifically about how they made their livelihood. Those names might not be household names for the average Civil War person, but I think it's important to discuss these firms and how they impacted the trade markets heading into the Civil War in 1861.
Yeah, absolutely. The I think that it is easy for us to understate how important slavery was in the pre-Civil War United States. There were 4 million people enslaved in the United States heading into the Civil War. And one of the things that I think I try to convey to my students when I teach the Civil War is that those people are worth billions of dollars, and that's in 1860 dollars. By comparison, right, the federal budget I think is less than $100 million heading into the Civil War. So we're talking about a staggering amount of money. Enslaved people are worth more than all of the capital invested on Wall Street. They're worth more than all the money held in the United States as banks. They're worth more than all the resources invested in the nation's railroads. The only thing worth more than people is land. And the reason enslaved people, as you say, they are worth their value comes in part from the work that they're expected to do, but it's also because, as you said, they're commodities that can be bought and sold, that slaveholders can buy and sell, and because slaveholders can buy and sell people at any moment, they constantly have this like dollar figure attached to them, and that then in turn can be translated into mortgages. It can be translated into collateral. It can be collateralized rather. And so and that money is really just everywhere in the 19th century United States. So yeah, it's absolutely hugely important. And I would say that, and we could probably talk more about this at some point, right? But one of the things that I sort of find interesting is just how sort of proximate, right? We as Civil War historians, we talk about Richmond, we talk about Savannah, we talk about New Orleans, and sort of the military aspects or the way that militaries are engaged with civilians in those places. But in most Civil War sites, you don't have to go that far to encounter something related to the slave trade. So, I mean, for example, if you were to visit if you go to Richmond and you go to the American Civil War Museum, you're less than a mile away from the city's slave trading district. You can still visit a corner of Robert Lumpkin's slave trading facility. Most of the rest of it has been paved over. It's under where I-95 is today for the most part. But it's very proximate, right? You can see almost, if the buildings weren't there, you could see the Virginia State Capitol. So it's really bound up with all these Civil War sites, all these better known aspects of the Civil War. One of the things that really surprised me as I was writing the book is just you don't have to push that far on almost anything in the Civil War to get to the slave trade.
I definitely agree with that. Having been to Charleston, and when I was on a tour there with one of my friends, she took me. She's like, this is where the slave trade happened. It's right there. Atlanta, I know, Darren, when you went to Atlanta, you took that picture where that one slave house, the slave auction site, used to be. So it's very much, you're right. You don't have to travel very far to find it, and it's very, it's very powerful to be there and realize, like, here it is. We're 160 years out from this, and this was happening here, and it's very powerful to be able to stand there, and it's sad too. In a way, it's very sad.
Mm-hmm. It evolved throughout. I mean, we mentioned Joseph Bruin from New Orleans, and in your book talks about the impact of General Benjamin Butler. When he sees the city and how that went and changed the slave market, and the Union Army's attitudes, really towards slavery and its impact of the enslaved themselves, and as well as the U.S. legal hurdles to anyone looking to buy and sell slaves. I mean, lack of buyers, due to Union occupation, for example, and how that changed. And I think it's important also to discuss the impact of Union armies to the slave market. Louisiana had a new constitution they put in towards the end of 64, right around there. Butler wanted to keep the slaves on plantations as much as possible to keep them working specifically for sugar for the Union cause. Mm-hmm. So we think of the North versus the South and how this whole thing goes, but it really came down to who would benefit specifically from it. For the Union versus ending slavery. So, you discuss primarily in economic terms, which is fantastic, but I think it's also important to talk about slavery, speak to economics, about how it impacted things like inflation. Yeah. You talk a lot about inflation. The slave trade versus Confederate currency is talked a lot about that. And, despite that some areas being cut off from the markets because of Union occupation, how that slave trade survived where federal armies were located. Talk about Memphis, Nashville, New Orleans, places like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complicated issue, and I think one of the things that I hope my book conveys, and one of the things that I found really difficult to unwind at times in writing it, is that the Union Army has in the United States has a very complicated relationship to slavery in many places. And, although I will say, I think there are ways in which I think my book suggested it might be a little less complicated. But you're right, like in New Orleans, right? So in New Orleans, for example, right? New Orleans had been the largest slave market in the pre-Civil War United States, over the decades between the start of the 19th century and the Civil War. At least 100,000, probably several tens of thousands more than that, people are sold in New Orleans as slave markets, sort of dispersed from New Orleans up the Mississippi River into the sugar parishes of Louisiana, and just to the farthest bounds of the Cotton Kingdom. Like New Orleans is the port that gives access to much of the growing Cotton Kingdom. It's also one of the first major Confederate cities to fall into Union hands. And what you see is exactly what you described. Like, Benjamin Butler is not there primarily to disrupt the institution of slavery, for both sort of reasons of preserving public order, uncertainty about how exactly the government's going to interact with enslaved people, and to sort of try to raise money for the Union war effort. Butler would very much like to keep enslaved people working in some capacity. But not all of his subordinates feel that way, for one. And enslaved people certainly don't feel that way. And so what you get is thousands of enslaved people fleeing to Union lines in Louisiana. And I think this is where maybe there's a little bit of a tension there, right? Because, Butler and his subordinate, or many of his subordinates, Butler and sort of the official policies of the United States, are kind of ambivalent about this. They want to deny Confederates the resource that enslaved people represent, but they also don't want to deal with large numbers of free Black people. That's not necessarily helpful to the war effort, and so there's a tension there. But what this does, right? The status of those people might be unresolved. How exactly the military is going to interact with them varies considerably. But the fact that those people can flee to Union lines makes them a very risky property in which slaveholders might want to invest, right? Sherman says this when he's occupying Memphis as well. Like, he says, essentially, as soon as an enslaved person can get up and walk out the door, and a slaveholder can't really do anything about it, or can't call on, for example, the local sheriff to help him, can't call on local power to help him back that up. Functionally, that person has ceased to be property. He or she might still be on paper, but the Union Army, by disrupting all these different, by disrupting the local governments, by disrupting Confederate authorities, by disrupting state authorities, they deal a really serious blow to the slave trade, and I would argue, by extension, the institution of slavery. So in some ways, it's both a more complicated story. Certainly, a handful of slaveholders still sell a handful of people in New Orleans after Butler gets there. But the fact that the Union Army isn't willing to support them in doing so is a mighty blow against the institution of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we saw how things change. Well, Lee's going to invade Maryland. He gets those two huge victories at the 7 Days and eventually Second Manassas, and how that begins to affect the slave prices in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to boost buyers' confidence in an eventual Southern victory. Hence, like a long-term bond, long-term slave trade prospects get better. Emancipation Proclamation after Antietam in 1862, along with that inflation and that collapsing Confederate infrastructure, right? So what do you have? Confederate paper now is becoming worthless. And like you said a bit ago, slaves presented the best long-term option for appreciation versus currency. Mm-hmm. So buying slaves versus keeping paper money becomes kind of a contradictory terms. People starting to dump Confederate paper left and right for anything they had felt left in value. There was Mississippi's governor, William Sharkey. He quoted, "Bad property as Negroes may be, they are still better than the money." So buying humans became a sound long-term investment. And you got to look at this like you're looking at stocks and bonds. It's unfortunate, it's very transactional. But if you were confident in a rebel victory in the end, slaves were by far, in a way, the best investment versus anything else in their minds.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple of things going on there, right? I will say as an aside, when you read Civil War letters, which I know you guys do all the time, right? We sort of tune out things, right? We get so used to them that we kind of tune out aspects of these letters. And once I start, but I keyed in. There was a letter I was reading. Actually, it was by a Virginian slaveholder. He and his father-in-law, a guy named Francis Smith, and his father-in-law were having this argument, kind of a long-running family argument about, like, they lived in Eastern Virginia. It was a very exposed place to be. Union gunboats were constantly going up and down the York River. A number of people had fled from them. And so they're having this conversation about how do they preserve the family's wealth coming out of the Civil War. And Francis Smith says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says essentially, look, the only smart thing to do is, if you think we're going to win, which most Confederates do for most of the war, the only smart thing to do is buy enslaved people, because you can't hold Confederate money. Most people don't have that much confidence in Confederate bonds, for example. They kind of think the Confederacy probably not going to pay them back. Maybe you can buy land, but you can't take land with you if you have to go somewhere. Maybe you can buy cotton, but you have a similar problem, and you're not going to be able to sell it really until the war is over. And so for many Confederates, the answer is, well, we buy enslaved people. And there's a logic to this. I'd said that the slave trade sort of expands across the 19th century. Well, the prices offered for enslaved people had gone nowhere but up for the 15 years before the Civil War. There's a financial crisis in 1857, and it does a lot of damage to the national economy, but it doesn't touch the prices of enslaved people, right? And so in purely economic terms, Confederates have this hope that the prices offered for enslaved people will continue to rise. You all are in Gettysburg. Henry King Burgoyne, the boy colonel of the Confederacy, who's seriously wounded on the first day. Well, the last letter he writes to his father is advising his father to buy enslaved people, because he thinks
a 13-year-old girl.
Yeah, well, that's right, and we can talk about that, right? That one of the reasons, and this is one of the most tragic parts of this. One of the reasons that enslaved people represent such a good investment is that if you own enslaved women and they have children, slaveholders also own those
Right.
children. And
Right.
so enslaved people reproduce themselves as property. And so that was one of the other things that surprised me as I was going through this book is you see enslavers not only targeting people during the war, but specifically young people and in many cases, particularly young women. The only other thought I kind of where I started this tangent, right, is I think one of the things we tune out in Civil War letters is all this talk about prices because we're like,
Mhm.
yeah, we know, but it really is everywhere. I think especially for those of us, battles are really interesting, and of course we want to talk about them, but I think we underrate often how serious a problem inflation is for the Confederacy, and particularly for Confederate civilians. And Confederate civilians are, they're constantly complaining about prices. They write to politicians all the time saying, "What can you do for me? How can you give me some relief?" But one of the ways that they try to get around that is they try to find whatever form of property they think will hold value. And sometimes this is really optimistic. They're saying, "Well, I think enslaved people." I don't think I said this, but in 1860, an enslaved man, like a young enslaved man, is worth $1,000 to $1,200. And it's an enslaved woman, 800 to 1,000 probably. Depending on how you count that, depending on which metric you're using, that's anywhere from 30,000 to $100,000 today. It's serious. We're talking about serious money. The the challenge, though, right, is so that can reflect great confidence in the Confederacy, right? If you think the Confederacy is going to win, the price is just going to keep going up, and slaveholders feel that they will profit. The flip side is sort of it's also rooted in pessimism about Confederate money, which isn't necessarily tethered to how Confederates feel about how the war is going. If you read a lot of Civil War stuff, you'll know Confederates compare themselves to the American Revolution all the time. And they say, well, look, the American Revolution had the revolutionary United States had terrible finances too, so we'll probably be okay.
Mm.
But just as a hedge, they're buying enslaved people to try to ward off the worst, even if they're not that enthusiastic about the idea of holding enslaved people as an investment, even if they realize an enslaved person could run away, still better than holding Confederate money, right? Like the quote you read from William Sharkey, I think is one of the ones that really lodged in my brain as I was
Mhm.
doing this research. And yeah, so it's all over the place, and the degree to which, you know, however Confederates are thinking about the war, at some point the slave trade is going to crop up. Was really remarkable as I was researching this book.
Yeah. In their confidence ever waned. I mean, even after Antietam, Emancipation Proclamation,
Hmm.
the confidence probably waned a little bit, but what does it do? Just like when the stock market happens, it creates buying opportunities, right? So in areas
Yeah,
where the federal army advanced, slave owners sold slaves and having them versus fall into Union hands. So what does this do?
yeah.
It creates a surplus, which is going to drive some prices down, which is going to
Hmm.
create an opportunity that some exploited in the South. You mentioned Henry King Burgoyne, but there's a lot of generals, Stonewall Jackson, Nathan Shanks Evans. They're all recorded. You mentioned in your book of having them buying families of slaves, for cheap money, taking 25 to 50% off of the usual prices after the Emancipation Proclamation, right? So then the Confederate financial crisis is going to hit in late of 1862. You mentioned high inflation is going to be caused by large numbers of those printed notes circulation by
Hmm.
Confederate Congress. And like you said, the distrust of currency at the highest levels continues to drive people to trade in people
Hmm.
versus money. The Southerners had, like you said, zero confidence in Confederate bonds. They preferred people, which in essence was currency. So what do you have? You have the 1864 Currency Reform Act, which basically taxes notes not exchanged for the new ones, hoping to stabilize bond prices and slow currency issuance. But within a few months, what does it do? It jacks inflation again.
Hmm.
And you look at the
Hmm.
numbers. Hill Dickinson and Company, 1.2 million in Q1 1864 in sales, drops to 152,000 in Q2, because why? They refused to take the old currency because the buyers didn't have the new currency yet. So what they're going to offer up real estate, but again, it's sad, but you could replace humans and talk about, you could talk about the mortgage notes today. The concept is so similar. Georgians, offering their entire plantations for slaves when he realized that his property was in William Sherman's path in 1864. So it becomes what option is going to ultimately be the best financial the best situation, people with a mode.
Well, and I think that's right. So I think that's right. And one of the things that you're absolutely correct, right? Like as the war goes on, the Confederate situation gets more and more dire, and as the economy breaks down, it's harder to buy and sell anything, including people. You noted that Hill Dickinson and Company is one of the largest Richmond slave trading firms. I will say one of the problems I ran into in this book is getting sort of good data. There are all kinds of missing sources that made it really hard for me to get a really consistent estimate or a really clear picture across the entire war of what the slave market looks like. But their sales just absolutely crater in the spring, in the late spring, early summer of 1864, and I think that's it probably doesn't help that the Overland Campaign is happening. It probably doesn't help that Union armies are sort of grinding closer and closer to Richmond. But I think the biggest issue, the biggest problem is just this absolute cratering of the Confederate economy, thanks to ongoing inflation, thanks to the breakdown of transportation networks. The Confederacy sort of encounters this perfect storm in particular. It starts in 1863, but it really accelerates in 1864 of military destruction, but also just absolute financial collapse. And so I think that more than a lack of confidence necessarily in their eventual victory, or more than a lack of a belief that enslaved people would remain enslaved, I think that it does serious damage to the slave market in the summer of 1864. But, and this I think to some of the other examples you raised, it doesn't destroy it. And the reason it doesn't destroy it is that slavery is so flexible. And because enslaved people are property, Confederates can really use them to adapt to the war in a lot of ways. If you're, like you said, if you're in the path of Sherman's army, you can try to exchange property for enslaved people whom you can move. If you are dealing with a sudden shortfall of cash, let's say you're short of cash to pay the taxes that the Confederate government is levying on you. One of the ways that slaveholders meet that is by selling people. And besides that, there's all the ordinary stuff that undergirds, that just rumbles on in the background of American slavery, that just continues. I mean, I was going to say people continue to die, but people die in extraordinary numbers during the Civil War, and that means that their estates have to be resolved, their debts have to be paid off, and so this courts throughout the Confederacy continue to divide, enslaved families continue to sell people off. And so what you see, and one of the things that really you kind of floored me as I was doing this research is just the sheer range of reasons for which Confederates bought and sold people. I mean, it allows Confederates to do an enormous amount of different things to adapt to the war. The war puts significant strains on almost everybody in the Confederacy, and it's not to say that every Confederate responds through the purchase and sale of a person, but that option is always there, and a great many of them avail themselves of it.
I think that's something that does not get talked about enough when we study the Civil War, is even into 1864, when the game has definitely changed. When you have Sheridan in the Valley, you have the Overland Campaign, and then you have Sherman in Atlanta. Even then, the Confederates, as you say, they are adapting, and the slave trade is still happening. That is something that I think kind of gets put in the background, and we don't realize how much it is still affecting and is part of the war.
Yeah.
Oh, I was struck relatively late in researching and writing this book. I was working through the records of the Freedmen's Bureau, and which I love to plug this. The Smithsonian is hosting an ongoing transcription of Freedmen's Bureau records, and they are phenomenal for learning about the Civil War era. And so I would encourage many of them, not all of them. I couldn't tell you what percentage are now searchable, but they're a remarkable resource. But to your point, Mary, the I was amazed at how many. One of the things the Freedmen's Bureau does is it tries to put Black families that had been divided back together. And often that to help that process, African Americans would provide sort of whatever information they had about the last time they'd seen someone or a point of reference about when they'd been split up. And I was struck by just I found a significant number that said, well, I was in the Shenandoah Valley and I was sold right before Cedar Creek, or I was sold right before or my family member was sold right before Sheridan's army came through, Woodstock or Mount Jackson or one of these towns. And like you say, that's a point at which, looking back from 2024, we say, well, the game is up at that point, and yet this traffic continues. Uh, for any number of reasons, because there's desperation, because it helps solve some immediate personal issue, because Confederates simply can't face losing all the value of these people. I mean, it really is. It grinds on and on and on.
Mm-hmm.
And just looking as an investment, I mean, they saw slaves as investments, obviously in the post-war era. But again, when things were going bad in '64, you got Grant doing his thing, you've got everything going on in '64. But again, they saw these Northern victories not only as temporary setbacks, but again, it's like a gambler in Vegas. You're down your last $100, but that's all you have. The
Hmm.
paper you have is worth nothing. So the only hope you have basically is to continue to buy, because that's your only real hope.
Yeah.
You mentioned King Burgoyne, and he's by no means. We talk about some of the people, these generals that we know. E.P. Alexander, the artillerist from under in Pickett's charge. Speaking of
Hmm.
Gettysburg, he was talking about purchasing a mother and child for $2,000 because he just thought it was a good investment because there was no other
Hmm.
way to put your money. So despite all
Just a
this stuff,
couple of weeks after
yeah,
Gettysburg, it's
right,
worth noting.
exactly,
Right after
exactly,
Gettysburg.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, and then the other thing that your book talks about, which I think a lot of people don't understand too, is the concept that the slaves were leased out to the Confederate government to work in factories making Confederate weapons, the mills, because the government
Hmm.
also depended on their labor. So, the war, like we saw the Civil War, how it changed militarily. People talk about Napoleonic style to trench warfare, but it changed from the South, especially from a rural society, to it had to evolve to fight this modern war. And so now slaves
Hmm.
are being recruited and being rented from their owners or bought outright to work in the arsenals, to work basically
Hmm.
outside of the fields. Tredegar Iron Works, you mentioned that a little while ago. Selma Naval Works had 300 slaves working for it. Shelby Iron Company owned
Hmm.
29 slaves outright. Gorgas Mining Company rented slaves throughout '64 and '65. Virginia Railroad
Hmm.
owned 35 slaves. People don't always think about the slave trade. You think about the fields, you think about the cotton, but the reliance on slave labor was really ramped up to help meet the tasks of the growing Confederate war effort. And then you have the 21 Negro Law that came out,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, that's right. And this cuts in a couple of different directions, but you're absolutely right, right? We talk unless you really enjoyed reading Earl Hess, right? We don't talk that much about logistics during the Civil
Mm-hmm.
War.
Mm-hmm.
But logistics are so important, and the Confederacy's logistics depend in large part on enslaved laborers. One of the reasons that the Confederacy can field armies of the size that it does is that enslaved people remain behind the lines, working in the fields, cultivating the food, and helping maintain the railroads and the roads and the other logistical support of that army. But also, you're absolutely right. there's a certain irony, right, that we often think about the Confederacy as this agrarian society, but it has to ramp up to fight an increasingly modern war. There's a great Josiah Gorgas quote that I'm going to butcher, but he talks about all of the different installations the Confederacy had to build to fight this war: arsenals, powder works, lead mines, and so forth and so on. And some of that is brand new. Some of it is scaling out existing facilities. Tredegar Ironworks, again, part of which is now the home of the American Civil War Museum in Richmond. Before the Civil War, Tredegar had regularly hired 40-ish enslaved people to work there. So it's something they'd been doing before. By 1864, they're hiring several hundred. And this is, as you pointed out, right? This is true throughout the Confederacy. Military installations, military factories, military adjacent factories, factories that produce shoes, textiles, things like that. But and most of those people, those facilities rent. They will hire for 6 months or for a year. And they had been doing that, like I said, for years. In large part, it's because it's cheaper year to year to sort of rent a person than to own a person. It's a much larger investment of capital to buy a person outright. What I would say, the only thing I would say is that many of these installations actually do buy people during the Civil War. Partially, I think that's due to the competition. Tredegar is competing for enslaved laborers with all sorts of other facilities, with railroads, with the Confederate government, among other things. The Confederate government puts hundreds of people to work building fortifications and things like that. And so it's advantageous for a place like Tredegar to own a person outright, especially if they are really integral to the work that they're doing. One of the moments that stood out to me is I was working through Tredegar's papers and I found a receipt for a blacksmith named John, so someone who had skills doing the sort of work that Tredegar requires, and they paid a pretty high price for him. I can't remember exactly how much, but one of the things that struck me is they also bought his family. Um, and I can only assume that that's because they valued John's work and they didn't want to risk him running away to get back to his family. They thought or perhaps even fleeing to Union lines if his family were local. And so the slave trade does a lot to help the Confederacy negotiate the challenges of scaling up for the war, and also navigating some of the pressures that the war puts on slavery, and they use the slave trade to try to shape the choices that are available to individual enslaved people.
Yeah, and then we talked specifically about how a lot of the soldiers went away. I hinted a second ago at that 21 the Negro law, right? Which basically
Hmm.
meant it was a law that was passed to have some white men stay home if you own 21 slaves to protect from rebellions. And then you started to see a lot of the rich man's war, poor man's fight
Hmm.
conversation, right? But again, this is what was going on because if you're a slave, being sold was obviously their ultimate fear. But again, when you saw the economy falling apart, like you said a little while ago, now the slaves are being sold barter system for horses, for example.
Hmm.
They don't have
Hmm.
enough food to feed the slaves, so they have to sell them.
Hmm.
And but you had to maintain that trade. You had to keep the machine going. And then you started to see the UCT guys, Gettysburg Campaign,
Yeah.
for example, captured, sent south to work in the mills, in factories for that machine. Um, and the free people captured and sold into bondage. Again, it was the lifeblood of the Confederate economy, and which that country, the Southern country, protected very, very much. And when
Hmm.
you look at the rebel armies, doing whatever they can to preserve the slave markets, and the markets basically circulated enslaved and empowered enslavers right in the face still of emancipation, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and, and then you thought the fact the border states are still, slavery is still legal per the Emancipation Proclamation. But what was interesting is how it all changed and how you can see them trying to break off pieces of the puzzle to make it work. They had that
Yeah.
that old 6-month moratorium, right, for jailers who, if they caught a slave, they had to hold him for
Hmm.
6 months, which allowed the owner. They cut that down to 1 month, because of so many escaping to the north.
Yeah.
So it was almost like you're trying to, catch a fish with a, with a strainer, and you're trying to get everything
Yeah.
and trying to maintain the water. Um, and some of the examples of Union troops you're starting to see through all this, and this is a part of I think slavery, where a lot of people don't get as well, is the pure capitalism aspects of it all, where examples of Union troops selling slaves back to their masters in Virginia because the masters are bribing them. Hey, if you catch a guy, I'll throw you a little bit of money.
Hmm.
It adds
Hmm.
that second level of profiteering, where now the Union Army
Yeah.
is liberating slaves and then selling them back into slavery, which usually followed a second sail back deep south to the Confederate interior.
Hmm.
So it was this never ending cycle that both sides were playing into.
Yeah, I mean you're absolutely right. So the survival of the slave trade just it the fact that the slave trade survives and that white Southerners particularly have access to it creates and enables so many different responses, especially as you're saying, you're absolutely right. Like especially how they engage with and confront and try to hold off emancipation as much as possible, and that manifests itself in so many different ways. I feel like it's getting more and more publicity, but it's still, I think, relatively under discussed. The example of the Gettysburg campaign, where the Army of Northern Virginia, members of the Army of Northern Virginia, capture, or civilians following with them, capture and take to Virginia several hundred people during that campaign. I mean, the accounts of that are absolutely heartbreaking. And many of those people, not all of them, but many of them end up in the Richmond slave market. Same thing happens certainly during the Antietam campaign. Same thing happens as well during Early's invasion in 1864, right? Whenever the Confederate Army goes into Union territory, it puts African Americans in its path at extraordinary risk. And it's because the book the purpose of uh, you had Alan Gelzo on not long ago, right?
Yeah.
And I love the
Yes.
way he puts it in his Gettysburg book. His book, to have left those people in peace, he says, would run counter to the Confederacy's reason for being. I'm paraphrasing. He puts it
Mm.
better than that, but
Yeah.
it's so true. But it's also a moment of profiteering. It's a moment for slaveholders to try to make good losses that they believe that they'd suffered. But that sort of thing, the Gettysburg campaign, what happens? It happens in Kentucky when Confederates invade in 1862. Um, but what's much more common is sort of a similar version of that happening across no man's land, the space between the armies, where um, there is at least an opportunity for sanctuary for enslaved people with the Union Army. But for one, first they have to get there, and getting there often means going through or around or near the Confederate Army. And once they're there, they're not necessarily safe, right? You mentioned this example, and there's the most famous example of this takes place near Norfolk. There's a New York regiment that gets a reputation for selling people, for essentially grabbing freed people out of Norfolk and selling them to Confederates. Certainly that happens throughout. There's also, one of the things that I wished I could figure out is it. I read enough court cases that talked about the sale of an enslaved person, and these often have to do with the reason they make it into the courts is because it's usually an adult who's like a legal guardian for a minor, and so they have to account for how the
Mhm.
money that belongs to that kid is spent. Uh, and so when an enslaved person runs away, they have to account for that. Or if they want to sell an enslaved person who has run away, they have to explain it because it's not necessarily in the kid's financial interest. Um, a bunch of these have a reference to paying someone to go into union lines to bring a person out. And I have not ever encountered a sort of firsthand experience of that. It's one of those things that I'm so curious to understand how it worked, what, like, what the negotiation, what the conversation, what that actually looks like. But it happens. So Union lines absolutely provide refuge. And Union soldiers say all the time when they encounter fugitives, they talk to them, and the fugitives often say, I fled because I heard that I was going to be sold the next day. or I fled because they sold my children and I realized I was next. Some version of this happens all the time. They talk about grandmothers coming in with children on their backs, like to protect them from being sold. And so the slave trade absolutely interacts with this process of emancipation, especially as it's unfolding on the ground. The Confederate frontier, wherever there's space, wherever a Union army is nearby, um, you see a wave of slave sales flooding away from the Union Army to the nearest slave market, whether that's Atlanta, whether it's Savannah, Charleston, Richmond, especially, but also Montgomery, wherever the nearest slave market is, you start to see people arriving. You start to see people arriving. John Jones, the diarist in Richmond, talks in the fall of 1862 how after the army sort of returned to the Rappahannock line, he talks about how Richmond is overrun with people sent from Northern Virginia and the Tidewater as well to Richmond for sale. Like, um, and again, it's one of those lines, like it's been sitting in his diary. His diary's been published for decades,
Mm-hmm.
and but unless you go looking for it, it's really
Mhm.
easy to overlook.
Yeah, and it's interesting as you were saying a few minutes ago. The federals' behavior really towards slavery was inconsistent at best, versus the rebels absolutely did not. And it's like you said a bit ago, when the Confederate Army were in federal territory like Pennsylvania, they took the institution of slavery with them, and they rounded up as many blacks as they could to sell them back, like just like you said. And so when the Union Army, Sherman, Sheridan, whoever, when you see the owners, the masters looking to get rid of these guys, you have an interesting dynamic where you have the masters running from the slaves instead of vice versa in some cases, right?
Yeah,
But the thing
yeah.
is too is you look at the Confederates' attitudes, even the foot soldiers, they look at them in a lot of cases as dollar figures. I think it was at the crater when basically there was a soldier
Hmm.
who said basically that we killed in our front $5 million worth of Negroes at the current
Yeah,
prices, and in some cases USCT troops they were too valuable to be shot, gave them $5,000 a head. So we're not going to shoot them; we're going to capture them. And so as the Yankees approach led to instability, again, it creates kind of an economic chaos where they're trying to sell the slaves too quickly, which could destroy the institution. And so when the slaves heard of the Union armies coming, it really expedited their attempts to try to sell them
yeah.
for fear of taking off. And so they had to change their game plan a little bit. So it was
Hmm.
now you're trying to deal in secrecy, because if the slaves found out, like you said a bit ago, you might be sold, they're going to take off. So you had to deal with this. And I think, and this was really, what this really did was kind of show a fatal flaw in that system, really, because at first fear, many of them looked to sell immediately when the Atlanta troops come in, because they tried to remove slavery from the landscape and it drove down the prices. So, I think in your book, you talk about a story of a guy from Columbia, South Carolina, who was with his young daughter at a store. And this story, this one stuck. I'm not going to lie to you. This one took me a minute to get through this one. Okay, he was at a store with his daughter in a bazaar, and she wanted him to buy her a doll. And he says, "No, I can buy you a real doll for less money than that doll costs." And that's the mentality
I
of it.
mean,
And it's sad when you think about it
Mm-hmm.
at a human level, but that story it kind of shows towards the end of the war how the whole thing went. And as fears of the end of slavery grew, what it did to people. And it's just it reminds you that these are humans you're dealing with, and not dollar
yeah.
figures,
Oh yeah, I mean absolutely, right. That's the thing that sort of the drumbeat that runs through this project, or that ran through the book as I was working on it is, every time you encounter this, you're talking about people whose lives are being destroyed. And that's where I mean I mentioned the Freedmen's Bureau records a few minutes ago, and that's where it's one of those places where those are incredibly powerful. Um, there's also a great project Judy Giesberg at Villanova is running, So African American families after the Civil War often placed what's it's so interesting. They're almost the inverse of fugitive slave advertisements. If you've ever come across those, right? If you've ever read
Mhm.
a Confederate newspaper, you see advertisements placed for fugitives from slavery. Well, these are almost exactly the opposite. They're advertisements placed by African Americans looking for family members from whom they'd been separated either in slavery or in the war or in both. And they're really remarkable. But they really help sort of to fight back against that idea that when you read Confederates letters, when you read especially, you are see the lens is people as property. Um, but especially when you get into the Freedmen's Bureau records, when you get into these advertisements, the human cost, the absolute tragedy of the wartime slave trade really shines through. Yeah, I mean that story, I came across that in Thavolia Glimp's book on women during the Civil War, and it floored me as I was reading it as well. It Yeah, at the end of the war, you have this strange mix of sort of fatalism. There are Confederates who sort of, I think, know they're going to lose and are sort of, they're making jokes in some cases about how this interacts with slavery. But you also have people who are in very deadly earnest. Some are speculating, but some, I there are Confederate cavalry during the retreat to Appomattox who are trying to acquire people, thinking they can keep them moving south.
Yeah,
I mean, it's really,
Thomas Rosser's guys, you know,
yeah, it's really remarkable.
and even you mentioned even after the surrender, you have the Speaker of the House of the Confederate House of Reps, a guy named Thomas Bocock. He's going to buy 16 slaves after Appomattox. So again, I guess you're thinking it's worth more than the paper. Maybe something will happen. It's the ultimate speculation. It's like buying crypto when it first came out, probably just as a real risky type of investment. But by the war's end, slavery is over, and much of that southern wealth is immediately wiped out. Much of it's slave property. It's going to reduce a lot of the South to poverty, and like you said a bit ago, it turns in for the slaves now. We're trying to find their families, and as I'm reading your book and you're talking about the Freedmen's Bureau, all I could think about is those videos of 9/11 when people are putting pictures of their families up and have you seen my son, have you seen
hmm
my daughter,
Yeah.
and that's what popped
Mhm.
in my mind. You picture these poor families going to the government because that's ideally where we're going to go. Michael Johnson, he's a historian. He said 25% of family separations that
Yeah.
took place during the late antebellum era happened during the war. So they're going to go now to go to extreme efforts to try to build these families back together again. And like you said, many go to Washington. They had a huge delegation to meet Andrew Johnson, the president at the time, to find out about these things. And so you can only imagine the dead ends and the red tape, but you have a
hmm
lot of people now because slave owners really did not want their slaves meeting in religious circles for fear of insurrection. So now they're getting together in church groups, which you still see today in that community.
Yeah.
They're going to Oliver Otis Howard directly, being
Yeah.
contacted. And there's some success stories. You mentioned in a book, there's a former slave named Rachel Jenkins, you mentioned in your book, who used the U.S.
hmm
Christian Commission and the Freedmen's Bureau to locate her father and some siblings. She contacted Howard directly to help find her mother. Um,
Yeah.
but
hmm
again, you can. This is. You don't have to be a Civil War buff expert, whatever, to imagine the human aspects of this. No one,
No.
like you said a bit. My father was sold at Cedar Creek. He was sold before Third Winchester. I want to find him, and this is now what you have late after the war, and it's heart wrenching to think about. And your book does a great job really describing that in a human level, because I think a lot of people don't think like that.
I think it's hard to
Yeah.
for people it's hard to think like that sometimes. But that's when we study history, we're meant to be made uncomfortable because it's
Yeah. And well, I think, yeah. Sorry.
no, go ahead.
I think the 9/11 comparison is a great one. You have this shattering moment and, people just disappear. And you work through the only resources that you have available to find them. Word of mouth. I mean, I'm always amazed anybody finds anybody in the 19th century, right? With the
Mhm.
technological limitations. I mean, I can give you just like sort of one example. It's again sort of up up in your neck of the woods. I found some of this too late to make it into the book, and so I wrote a piece. Hopefully, that'll get published before too long. So Thaddeus Stevens owns that ironworks up in the mountains
Hmm.
west of Gettysburg, and when the
Caledonia.
Confederates came through, they destroyed. Yeah, Caledonia. And so
Hmm.
when the Confederates came through, they destroyed the ironworks. They also took away a number of formerly enslaved people who'd worked there. Or I don't know if they were formerly enslaved. They took away a number of African Americans who worked at the ironworks, including a woman named Jane Lyles and several of her children. And after the Civil War, Jane Lyles wrote to Thaddeus Stevens. She'd been sold, they'd been taken to Richmond, and there she'd been sold. Confederates had sold her to Savannah and the children somewhere she didn't know. She thought in Virginia. And so she wrote to Stevens asking him basically to help her get back. Um, and Stevens goes to the Bureau and asks the Bureau to help her. And in the weeks in which the weeks in which this information is passing back and forth, Jane Lyles disappears. We have no idea what happened to her. But the wheels are set in motion. The Bureau goes looking for her children. They start sending out inquiries throughout Virginia. Bureau agents from a county outside Richmond, they come back and they say, "Well, we found some children. We think they're Jane Lyles' children. They were taken from Pennsylvania. Um, then they bring them to Richmond. Turns out they're not Jane Lyles' children. They're two other children who'd been taken from Pennsylvania. And so they were the children of a woman named Priscilla Marshall. And the Bureau is ultimately able to reconnect them with Priscilla Marshall, though they're still short one of their sisters. But we don't know anything about what happened to the Lyles family, right? So you have these stories like there are absolutely success stories. There are absolutely these moments that show yes, the Civil War has destroyed slavery. There's an opportunity to rebuild families that had been torn apart. There's an opportunity to build something new. But there's also people who are just, tossed into who knows where. And both of those things are part of this Civil War story. They're part of the story of the wartime slave trade. They're part of the story of emancipation, and they're part of the story of the Civil War.
Hmm.
And there are a lot of those, the nameless and the faceless victims beyond the battles who a lot of
Hmm.
people, you never knew what happened to your son, your daughter. You never found them again. And as much as the yeoman's effort by Howard and the rest of the Freedmen's Bureau did, and to their credit, they focus heavily on things like land ownership, especially education, for example, right? Which will be a huge
Hmm.
part of
Hmm.
Reconstruction and something that the Freedmen's Bureau really pursued deeply. And your book mentions too the ironies of what they did with the old slave pens too. Robert Lumpkin's Devil Half
Yeah.
Acre you mentioned in Richmond became a school for freed slaves, as did Joseph Bruin's office in New Orleans. Many of the slave jails were converted into warehouses, for example, but a lot of them were put into things to help assimilate back in again.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, the South still tried to limit freed slaves, obviously. Richmond wanted them to carry passes in the town, to work on public works projects, which some slaves felt were just as bad as slavery, some of the freed ones. And again, and you had people paying them, but you're still threatening to send them off to places like Cuba and Africa, and just get rid of them all.
Hmm.
And complaints consistently poured into the Freedmen's Bureau, which had to add to that daily psychological trauma that they've had to endure for their entire lives. So when you think about the
Hmm.
victims of the American Civil War, you tend not to think about the freedmen people, but it's an aspect that most people can never associate with and never can really understand. And that's why this book's important too, is because it shines a light on an aspect that I think most Civil War historians either don't want to know about or just have never had a chance to look about. But I think it's important. I think it absolutely is.
Hmm. I definitely agree. It's one of those things where, we all know that the Civil War, the reason was slavery, but you still hear that. But there was also this is like, no, it was slavery. And your book shows that. And it also shows just how tied to the economy it was. But it's also that human aspect, how terrible it was that the victims go beyond the soldiers. It's what happens afterwards to
Yeah.
the freed slaves that I think their story gets forgotten, and it's just as important as the other stories in the aftermath of the Civil War.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think I think when you look at the overall, and again, the Freedmen's Bureau, you could probably do a whole episode just the Freedmen's Bureau. But again, for all the limited staff they had, the threats they had to deal with, and some of the work that Andrew Johnson did to do everything he could to derail Howard's plan, it was that promise of the freedom they offered that ultimately gave hope to these families who, again, remained destroyed despite the best efforts put forward to try to give them freedom based on their own terms, who had to live for their entire lives and generations forward from the ghosts of bondage, which really the country still hasn't got over. It really hasn't. But especially during Reconstruction, because it was Reconstruction because of the assassination by Booth, it never really got off on the right track. It was screwed up in the beginning, and we're still dealing with the effects of it today. We're almost at the hour point, but I think again the book Unholy Traffic is a really good one. So YouTube people, you can see it right here. Got our copy right here. Yep. Definitely go ahead and buy it, because it's really it's an important read, and more so than an important read, it's a necessary read. It really is, because yep. it's an aspect of the war. You know what Chamberlain once said, right? The darkest parts of our history shine the most light on the past, right? And this book certainly is one that definitely appreciates us. So thank you for writing it, because I've never read a book like this. Admittedly, it's not the easiest read, because people don't like to read things they don't want to read about. But again, it puts things in perspective. It opens your eyes to a lot of different things, especially on the northern side, which I think a lot of people don't think about.
Well, I appreciate that. So one of my hopes in writing the book is that I think historians are people who are really interested in the Civil War and people who are really interested in slavery don't always talk to each other. And one of the things that I hope this book does is it sort of starts a conversation or introduces, if you're really interested in the history of slavery in the United States, I hope this book introduces you a bit to the Civil War. And if you're someone who is really interested in the Civil War, well, I hope this book introduces you a bit to American slavery. And so I'm glad that it's we're hopefully helping advance that conversation a bit.
Definitely, definitely.
So again, for the listeners, it's called An Unholy Traffic: Slave Trading in the Civil War South by Dr. Robert K.D. Colby. So thank you for joining us today to talk about this. I think this was a great discussion. It was one of my favorite discussions we've had with anybody, because it certainly is one that's an eye-opener.
It's something that we've wanted to discuss for a while. And when we got your book, it was like, okay, now we can discuss this aspect of the Civil War that is, sadly, it is still tough to broach. You're like, how do we approach this? But your book and you coming on here gave us the opportunity to do that.
I'm really glad. I'm really appreciative to you for having me, and I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Great.
So thank you. Thank you very much.
So before we jump off, what's next for you? What's on the horizon for you? Got anything cooking?
Yeah, I'm working on a few small things that sort of explore things that I wanted to talk about in this book but couldn't. But I'm working on I'm hopefully writing about one of the guys who barely shows up in this book. A man named William Andrew Jackson, and I'm trying to trace his life from enslavement into freedom, and then the work that he does in Reconstruction. So that's what I'm trying to research and write about right now.
Okay. Cool. Well, make us a promise, Robert. So when you write this book, you reach out to us so we can have you on again. Okay. So we'll definitely do that. So Mary, what's next for us?
So next up, we are going to be talking about the Trent Affair.
Oh, that's right. The Trent Affair.
Not talked about yet on this podcast, but we've
Charles
wanted to.
Wilkes, November of 1861, and the San Jacinto. That's a good one. We'll get to talk about James Murray Mason and John Slidell, international waters in Cuba and Bermuda. That, again, something I doesn't always talk about, where Lincoln got himself in almost a whole bunch of trouble but seemed to get out of it. But we'll definitely talk about the Trent Affair and a lot of things. I think we have a live coming up this weekend, I believe, Mary?
Yes, we're going to be doing our YouTube live stream Saturday morning. So, I mean, anybody listening to this, it's going to drop on YouTube either tonight or tomorrow, but then the audio recording a few days later. So hopefully you're able to catch us for that. And we will hopefully be doing another roundtable soon. So, Darren, thank you for being the awesome co-host you always are. And Robert, thank you so much for joining us for our episode 140. And to our listeners, we will see you all again soon.
Yeah, buy this book. Don't be cheap.
Yes,
Christmas
is
coming.
Christmas
buy the
is
book.
coming.
You'll thank me later. I promise you will. All right, everybody, have a great weekend. We will talk to you all soon. Have a great weekend. We'll see you all on the other side.
See you all later.
Peace out.